Good evening. Uh, this evening's session may be a little uncomfortable for some, and but it's a discussion I think that we need to have. It may be welcomed by others, but this needs to be addressed in Newfoundland and Labrador in a meaningful way. This evening's panelists, they bring a shared vision of creating a more inclusive community by tackling some of these tough questions. The session will be divided into three segments. The first is, kind of what is racism, its constructs, and then a vision for anti-racism here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and then putting these elements together, and there'll be a Q&A at the end. So, I'm your moderator, as you've heard, Vincent Charles Estick. I've been here in Newfoundland for about 11 years. I think we're referred to as CFAs or what have you, which is fine. Here for 11 years by way of the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa. I'm a former technology executive. I've had the fortune of working with a number of Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 companies in various aspects and various roles. So this evening, I would like all of you to help me welcome our panelists. Please help me welcome Laurabel. This young lady she's very passionate advocate of diversity, inclusion, and sits on various community boards. Robert Leamon, he's an advocate for Indigenous rights and the movement to end racism, and enjoys tackling some of the harder, larger issues such as the climate crisis and food insecurity. Over here to my left, we have Maria. Now, her passion in terms of activism, she carries intimate and vast knowledge of the number of barriers faced by international students and migrant workers. So please welcome the panelists. Robert, would you care to say anything else in terms of an intro about yourself, some of your background, your passions, and so on, and then we'll pass it to Laurabel and Maria.
Certainly, yeah. My name is Robert Leamon, but in Mi'kmaq, I would say that as Deluisi Lobeld. My name is Robert. My pronouns are he and him, and I am a Mi'kmaq land protector. I did not come to that understanding early in life. In fact, I spent many of my years in youth not knowing about Indigenous identity. Since I learned about that sort of in my late teens, early 20s, I've spent the last decade trying to really unpack that. And I think that's what's driven a lot of the activism that I've been doing now, whether it's as a Mi'kmaq land protector, or whether it's with the Anti-Racism Coalition, or as equity liaison with the Social Justice Cooperative, or a few different other ways that I'm able to give back. I think that's come from my own struggle with identity.
Thank you, Robert. My name is Laurabel Mba. So my kind of role in my journey here, I found myself as an activist early on in life. So I initially moved to Canada in the early 2000s with my family. It started in Ontario. And then over the course of the time, I decided to attend University of Memorial University. So that began where I began seeing diversity began to expand for me. So I was there where I was a Canadian, but I also happened to sit as a Black woman in spaces where people thought I was native to the province. So that was something that I had to kind of navigate, being a woman in spaces where women typically weren't represented, being a Black woman in spaces where Black women weren't represented. And that's kind of pushed me forward to where I find myself now, sitting on the St. John's Women's Council board, and where I'd like to be an advocate for Black women in spaces where we typically don't get to have a voice. And so that's something that's really driving me forward, kind of giving Black women a voice in places where we aren't represented, kind of moving forward that way.
Wow. Maria.
Well, thank you for all of that. My name is Maria. My pronouns are she and her. And I am originally from Colombia. I moved to Canada 8 years ago to attend Memorial University. And that is when I first sort of got involved into this world. In my first year at university, we formed the International Student Caucus to address a number of barriers and a number of, things that affected the life of international students. And that's when I got involved into this world, and I got out of university, and I got to experience what it was to basically thrive in Newfoundland, or thrive and struggle both at the same time as a migrant worker, trying to find work, trying to find how to navigate the different barriers and accessibility to services. And that just led me to get involved with Migrant Students United, and then it later led me to the Anti-Racism Coalition, where I am currently the co-chair for the Campaigns and Advocacy Committee, where we're currently leading an amazing campaign on healthcare for all, which is based on the barriers that a lot of migrants are facing in accessing healthcare in this province. Very glad to be here.
Wow, wow. So 8 years and
A little over 20 years in Canada and 11 years in Newfoundland.
oh wow. So I feel like a grandfather. I've been in Canada since I was 6 years old, right? So some people say that I no longer sound Caribbean, but I say give me a couple of drinks and that changes quite quickly. So what is racism? Let's define that. And this is a textbook definition. So I'm going to just read it from my notes. The textbook definition of racism is a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits, capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race, right? But there's individual racism beneath that, and then there's structural racism under that as well. And I won't really go into, systematic racism, and I won't go into those systematic racism because we know what those things are. They're just entrenched within institutions, and we understand what those things are. So from my perspective, there are varying forms of racism, and we won't go through a list of what those are, but they're lived experiences, and we live them on a daily basis in the province. Whether that's hate speech, whether that is physical violence, fetishism as well, or microaggression, and so on. They're just lived experiences. People may not hear about them in terms of our municipal leaders, our bosses, our friends, and so forth, but they happen every day. And most often than not, we internalize them, we're quiet about them, and we discuss them in settings similar to this. So, Robert, given your ancestral background, you have intimate knowledge of racism by exclusion. Could you share with the audience some of those experiences, what that means in terms of your background?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, I am Mi'kmaq and I'm of the Qalipu First Nation. But again, those are things that I didn't actually know from a young age. I grew up living on the West Coast, Little Rapids, or as I now call it, Moktuwek, near the Humber River area. And I grew up not knowing about my Indigenous identity. And that is one of the forms of racism by erasure, in that we're constantly told that, well, Indigenous people aren't in this province, or that even if you are here in this province, there's a barrier that you have to go through in order to prove that you are in fact Indigenous. That's why it wasn't until the Qalipu First Nation band was actually being formed in like 2009 or so, that was the first time we actually talked about being Indigenous as a family. And and societally, we've often taught this narrative that, well, Indigenous people aren't here, when in fact Newfoundland and Labrador actually has the third highest population of Indigenous peoples of any province in Canada. And that is even likely also in a low estimate, because when you consider the fact that more than 100,000 people applied for status with the Qalipu First Nation band. All that to say is that Indigenous people in this province are being excluded from equal opportunities to services, to access, or to other just community connections that would exist if it were not for their race, or if it were not for systems excluding based on race. And this is beyond just a question of like identity or recognition, because we also see that the way that this plays out in rural and remote communities and predominantly Indigenous communities. When you look at the way that particularly communities in Labrador have often gone without equal access to healthcare, phone, internet, basic services, often for days, weeks at a time. That is not comparable to what experience would be in other communities that are either more populated or less perceived as an indigenous predominantly community. This is not unique to the indigenous experience either. It's racism by exclusion is happening in a bunch of different forms across lived experiences.
Wow, wow. 100,000.
Yeah.
100,000. Wow. That just goes to show you, right? I'm still just wrapping my head around that number. And I really didn't know that the third largest population of indigenous
Yeah,
people
even
in
by the
Canada?
ones that are actually currently registered by the Indian Act or by the federal government's terms of who is indigenous, even by those measures, Newfoundland and Labrador has the third highest population of indigenous peoples at 8.9%, only behind, I think it's Saskatchewan and Manitoba. I forget which order they're in, but they're ahead of us.
Wow, wow. So, Laurabel, I'm going to give you a scenario, and I want you to unpack this for us in terms of this is racism by hate. So, read earlier, there was a report that came out earlier this week out of the United States in Texas. Grade 8, black girl. She was beaten up by 6 or 7 of her classmates that were white. Yes, hold on. I can see your temperature rising, as mine did as well when I read it. They're not being charged under a hate crime charter.
Okay.
These students. Difficult to understand why not, but this is racism purely by hate, and this is something that I would like you to unpack for us.
Right. So first, that's astounding to hear that they're not being charged under a hate crime charter. I'm surprised to see that they're not being charged at all in this situation. So racism by hate is the form of racism that we're most used to hearing and seeing in the media. It's one where acts of criminal violence are usually taken against people due to their ethnicity or their race. It is one that is plastered on TV screens, on newspaper articles, on social media. It's one that is truly pushing the trauma on racialized folks. It's one that continues to harm racialized folks. Racism by hate is entrenched in our community. It comes in many forms, whether it be as little as small acts of bullying where children are being called slurs in their schools, where it's over text and things like that, and gets as large as where we have incidents of physical assault that happen on the playground, but they do also happen in bars and restaurants on the street. It's one that most racialized folks now actively try to prevent themselves from. It's one where racialized folks, when we are going out in public, we take extra steps and extra precautions to prevent situations where we are attacked, whether it be verbally or physically. So as a Black woman, I can talk about myself in personal experience where it comes, so racism I hate, where it can becomes an issue even in the workplace, where dress codes and codes of conduct have specifically target minorities, where your hair can't look a certain way. So right now I have braids in, and there was a point where I was in a workplace and I was about to have my natural hair out for the first time in my life. And I had to read my dress code to see if my hair was acceptable. I had to call coworkers and family members to see if I was going to be able to present myself in a way that was professional and where I wouldn't have any negative impacts or any hateful words or any hateful actions taken against me for presenting myself as the most authentic version of myself. So racism by hate is something that where we see discrimination and acts that could be criminally charged against racialized folks, and where these things can exist in various industries and various situations. It's the one we are most aware of. It's the one we are most afraid of, because the rest we can typically handle. But this is the one that where our lives are in danger. And this is one that racialized folks carry a lot of trauma, not just personally, but there's a lot of generational trauma for racialized folks when we talk about racism by hate. And it's the one we're most trying to push ahead of.
And I mean, along with that, the one thing that I've noted right across the country is that there really is not a lot of hate crime reporting websites that are available, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's one in Alberta. They recently launched one in BC for K to 12 and so on, for bullying and so forth. But I have yet to see anything here in the province. Maybe that's something that we can talk about and strive for. But I wanted to, you mentioned something key, and we talk about this all the time amongst ourselves, and that's that trauma aspect of these incidences and how it's like a PTSD,
Yeah.
right? It truly is, and that it tends to follow us. It determines, how we act, how we behave, sometimes where we go,
Yes.
how we dress, and things like that to avoid certain situations. I myself, by example, well, I like to dress and look good anyways, but, we did a social experiment a number of years ago before leaving Ontario. I was in a tracksuit, which in public, which I don't ever do, but it was a controlled environment, went into a situation, and just how I was viewed and feared, right, as this guy with the hood on and so forth. 20 minutes later, we had a friend. It was we were all friends here. It was a white gentleman that went in dressed the same way, tatted up and whatnot, and the reaction was completely different, right? That is one of those things that, in terms of trauma, that does carries with you, because you ask yourself those questions. Is there something wrong with me? Do I need to act away, dress away? And then you kind of find that you're not being yourself.
Exactly.
Right? Things like that. The dress code thing, just kind of anecdotal. When I worked for IBM, as part of your employment, you actually signed a dress code charter.
Yeah.
Right? But back then, it was nothing to do with having braids or natural hair. It was your hair had to be trimmed, white shirt only, things like that. It was it was a dress code of conduct for business. Really, really different. Wow.
That's true.
Ooh. Maria, how are you doing?
Conversations are hard, so important, but yeah.
All right. So we know that words hurt, right? Mm-hmm. They matter, and they have long-term effects, as we've talked about. But these words also used to invalidate us, to insult, dismiss, alienate, and what do we refer to those as? Those are forms of microaggressions, right? So Maria, I know that you've had some intimate experience with some of these. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I like to talk about microaggressions because I think sometimes they build up sort of like the stage for these kinds of things to happen. And I think it's a good way to start this conversation, because it's one of the most common, like, everyday experiences of racism. And when I refer to microaggressions, they can be just sort of like verbal or even like environmental cues, or even just body language that communicates sort of like derogatory, hostile, or racist ideas. And whether they are intentional or unintentional, they're just sort of like reproducing these harmful stereotypes and these racist ideas that over time they build up on the racialized folks who experience them, and that leads to just sort of like an exacerbated feeling of isolation, of otherness, of non-belonging into their own communities and to the places that they want to participate in. So I think the thing with microaggressions is that they can seem harmless, but they are the kinds of things that experience a number of times, and you start to feel this sense of, oh my gosh, I will never belong here. I will never be a person that is validated in the space that wants to just simply exist. And I think one of the most common places I experienced that was when I was working at the food industry. I was working at a coffee shop for 2 years, and whenever I was on the cash, one of the most common things that this will happen almost every day, people will ask me, where are you from? And like, this is this is just a way to start a conversation, and like it's, you know, like most of the times I'm just totally fine with it. But the thing is, like, these things are usually just paired with other kinds of comments, which are assumptions. So people will be like, oh, is that an accent that I hear? Are you from Cuba? Are you from Brazil? So people are already just identifying me as a person who it speaks in a certain way that is, it's already identifying me like, you're not from here. Like, I look in a certain way that I'm not from here. And, you know, most of the times I'm like, I'm okay. But after you're hearing these kinds of comments for a period of 2 years, you're like, okay, it doesn't matter how long I am in this province. I'm always going to be identified as a person who is not from here. So it just builds this sense of non-belonging, this sense of isolation, this sense of just inadequacy in the places that I inhabit. And the thing with that is that it's also just sort of paired with these other sorts of microaggressions. Like, for example, I will talk about experiencing racism, or experiencing, you know, like the barriers that I face when with immigration, and people will be like, oh, but it's okay, you probably don't experience much of that because you're basically white. So on the one hand, I'm identified as a person who doesn't belong almost every day because people are recognizing that I have an accent, or that I probably look like I'm not from here. And on the other hand, people are dismissing that experience of racism by saying, oh, you don't experience that. So it's both an experience of erasure and dismissal, and an experience that just builds this sense of non-belonging. Yeah.
I mean, and things like, you know, which I've heard in the community is, you know, you're exotic.
Yeah.
Right. And they want to date you because you're exotic. Right. Or, I mean, you know, other forms are, I mean, most folks here know what I do for a living. So I do service calls. So I go into people's homes and whatnot. You know, and conversations, oh, you know, how long have you been here? I've been here for 11 years. Oh, you speak really well for being here for 11 years. I said, well, what do you mean? I don't have a Newfoundland accent? Is that what you're saying? Mm-hmm. And it has always gone over my head until I realized what that was. Mm-hmm. Right. So, so are you able to give a couple of other, you know, instances or examples of microaggressions so that some of the folks tuning in have a better idea or sense of what, like two or three examples that they could relate to in terms of what a micro, because we may all do it and not even realize that it's what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so like usually, you know, like when you're told, and this is one that I experience all the time, where are you from? And the thing is, like, when you start to build up on this conversation, there is a number of microaggressions that come up and surface when you're you know, involving yourself into this conversation. So the first one is like, oh, I'm actually from Colombia, and people are like, oh, like, I have been in Cuba for vacations, you know, and it's like this kind of like assumptions. So like, you know, you're already being like categorized as like this sort of like, you're being put in like a bubble of like, oh, you're all the same sort of thing. So that's just one that leads to that. But it's also like what you just said. Oh, you speak really good English. And it's like, you know, well, I have been here for so and so many years. But that can also just lead or just set the stage for blatant racism. That's that's in my experience. When you involve yourself in these conversations, I've heard things like, oh, you know, like, and this is something that I have been told. Oh, you look like a Latin princess. You look like so. These forms of exoticism. So whenever you involve yourself in these conversations, you never know where they're going to lead to, because it is a way to identify you as an other. Like, it's a way of othering, of isolation, of like, you're different from me, you're not from here. So like, it's just setting the stage. And I think that's the problem with microaggressions. They just kind of sort of like lead to that, or they allow people to get there.
No, very, you know, very, very, very true. Very true. So why should anyone listening in care? Or why is it important? Why should, you know, M&L folks listening in, why should they care? You know, from our perspective, and we, you know, something that we talk about all the time, and this is from my own perspective, it's a choice for us to be here in the province. We're here for a purpose and reason, as we all are. You know, we're here to build lasting relationships participate in the democratic processes, and so on, contribute to building our province, building our economy, being successful, simple things, just here to live, right? But not everyone sees it that way. And we experience some of those things. We talk about things like communities and building communities and communal trust and so on and so forth. Laurabel, how do we go about doing that in some of this in the climate, right? Like how do we go and show that we care about our communities, we want to help build and develop them? And
So when you started talking, you asked, why are we here? Like that was the main question you asked, and why are we here? And I know why we are all here, and we're all here because we truly care about Newfoundland. We care about the province, we care about this people. This is where we have made our home. This is where we want to continue to make our home. So we are Newfoundland. We see ourselves as Newfoundlanders. The way we found ourselves to be Newfoundlanders might be very different than those who are listening currently, but Newfoundland is a community for us. So it's important to us to see this province succeed. And success is something that matters to everyone who's listening, to everyone who lives here. The success of this province is something that's near and dear to all our hearts. So what people might not know is a lot of marginalized and racialized folks within the province have built communities that exist separate from the municipalities we find ourselves in. We have communities that span the entire province that do not follow the borders of towns or cities. These are deeply entrenched in the ways we communicate with each other. So these communities are places where we're able to share our struggles, we're able to share our successes, we're able to help newcomers who happen to also identify as racialized or immigrants navigate the processes and the systems of the province. So when we look at our municipalities and we look at our local government leaders, we need them to care about us as well. We want them to be able to find these little pockets of racialized folks and immigrants or others, people who find themselves being othered within the province that have built these little communities. We need you to connect with them. We need you to build trust and communication with them. So that way, when you talk about ways to make your towns and your cities and your communities safe and successful, these voices need to be represented at the table as well. Because you might not know the struggles that are already currently being faced by the people who find themselves residents and citizens of where you call home. So if you aren't able to have those open lines of communications, you aren't aware of all the little gaps and loopholes and places where people are falling between the cracks. So it's important for our government leaders to open lines of communication where people can talk honestly and openly about the successes, about where you're doing great as communities, where you're succeeding and excelling and making people feel welcomed, and places where people aren't feeling like they can be their authentic selves, where they can truly come out and say, hey, I'm having a hard time navigating whatever process this is, whether it's access to food, whether it's access to buying homes or healthcare. They are struggles for people, but if they don't feel like they're represented within their leadership, they're not going to go to their leadership. They will talk about it within ourselves, but these problems don't get solved unless we're able to talk to people who are already at the table.
And those struggles are not unique to our community, to minority communities. They're just not.
Nope.
Robert, anti-racism matters in every community, even if you don't see it. True?
Absolutely, and the reason that it's so important in every community is because even if you, as a municipal leader or someone who's helping service your municipality or whatever it is in the work that you're doing, even if you individually don't see Black, Indigenous, people of color in your community, know that we are here. We have always been here, and we always will be here, and that's an important part of recognizing the history of this place in the way that, from a perspective as an Indigenous person, it's these systems and institutions that have worked over generations to try to tell the story that Indigenous people are not here, or to try to invalidate the experiences or to make feel unwelcome anyone who's a race other than white. So I guess when we're thinking about why should you care in your own community, even if you don't see us, one piece is that you shouldn't be assuming that someone is or isn't racialized based on just your ability to visibly see it, because there are in this province and everywhere places where people may present as white. Like I struggle every day. I put on 6 different outfits before coming here tonight because I was trying to figure out where on the spectrum of white to Indigenous I might land and how that might be received in terms of like trying to get the point across, both as someone who is like validly Indigenous versus someone who's not too Indigenous to be written off. So thinking about like why you should care in your community, don't make assumptions about people's race, lived experiences, or anything else. And even if you are in a place where you're thinking, well, you know, I'm pretty sure, then you should be asking yourself, well, why aren't you seeing racialized people? Why are you not seeing Black, Indigenous people coming through your doors? And that is often from a lack of trust, not necessarily with any individual person, although sometimes it is. It's more often a result of systems over generations that have pushed out Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and made us feel unwelcome. And that's why we need to change that and work towards building welcoming, safe, inclusive communities for everybody.
It's to strip away that separateness, right? That we see and feel. We oftentimes talk about allies and what that means to us. Allies are willing to sit and have these difficult, hard conversations. We know that they're uncomfortable, but that's one of the reasons why, Maria, that they should care, right? It's conversations about being an ally and what does that mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I think what Robert said is important, that is like to build communities, it is important that we create spaces that are welcoming and that are inclusive. And basically, these conversations are hard to have. Anti-racism can be hard work, but that being uncomfortable is part of the process. Being uncomfortable and sit with that feeling of uncomfortable, of being uncomfortable, is important of the learning process. And I think one of the things it is that in order to be an ally, it is important to establish how do we create that conversation. So establishing ground rules to have these conversations, it is important. So there are like a number of principles that people can agree on in order to just sort of like build these spaces. And one of them is a space for self-reflection. So if somebody comes to you and says like something you've been said has been harmful, or something that you have been said has been problematic, the first step is to listen. But also to realize that in any space where we are trying to have conversations with community, there's going to be privilege, and there's going to be power dynamics, and realizing that as a base for conversation is very important. And it is also important to realize that we are all in a space of learning and unlearning behaviors that are problematic. So whenever somebody comes and again says like, you know, something that has been said has been hurtful, something that has been said is not okay, it is important to take immediate action, to offer an immediate apology, to listen to the voice of others that are in the room, to give space to listen to the different perspectives and opinions, to take steps and to just build sort of like ground rules for steps for behavioral change. And it is also important to recognize in a space that everybody needs to have an equal opportunity to speak, so that there are rules for equal opportunity for everyone in a space is also important. And also rules like speak for yourself, don't speak for others, don't use other people's experiences or other people's stories in a room, and always be aware to check that you're aware of your own biases, of your own judgments. So whenever you're in a space, you're sort of like building these conditions for these conversations to be able to happen in an anti-racism lens and anti-oppressive lenses. So build the conditions for conversations is important.
Yeah. No, completely agree, and so very true. The next segment in our discussion is what does anti-racism look like, and should it look like in Newfoundland and Labrador, right? We talk about it being proactive and inclusive and all of these other things, and there's no single approach, right? It's multifaceted. There's lots of steps. There's lots of people to be involved, lots of discussions to be had, processes to be put in place, and so forth. But one of the simplest things to do really is moving away from being reactionary, right, in terms of being more proactive. And we've had an example of some of those things. With ads being played and things like that, and we've tackled those. So it's also about identifying some of the power dynamics in the positions of folks that are in power, and with the institutions, and that power symmetry. It exists. We need to admit that it does exist. We need to admit to its subtleties, and then of course, how do we address those, right? So anti-racism actively connects municipal governance with community, and this is said to increase public confidence and trust. Why do you always seem to get the community building trust pieces and so on within our discussion? Oh, because it's your area of expertise. That's why. That's why.
Maybe a little. But it is important when we're talking about anti-racist work, about building communities, just because we do not exist on our own. We are not little bubbles. As much as COVID makes us feel like we are a bubble unto ourselves, we do not exist isolatory. So in order for people to feel welcome and to feel connected to the places they find themselves in, community is how that's done. And you want to build communication, and you want to be proactive instead of reactive, because if you're being reactive, the trauma has already been caused. The damage is done. You're trying to rebuild a bridge that has been burnt. We don't want to have to wait for a bridge to be burnt. So you want to originally start going into these communities, knowing that there is a bias, there is a power dynamic that you may not have thought of before, but you are now becoming more aware of, and you're going to state that openly to the communities that you're speaking with. Be like, we understand that you might not currently be represented in the government. You might not currently be represented at the table. So how do we change that? What do you need to see? What do we need to do to make you feel like you can trust us, one, where you can openly talk about the struggles you're facing, the successes, or where the gaps exist? And then when you open that table, you open the seat, when you give people a seat to be their own voice, that's when you can truly begin to see change. So we had the incidences with commercials and things being said where we had to react. And that was great. We did react in that time, but we don't want to have to wait for things to blow up for their change to be done. We know there's a problem now, so it's time for us to take the steps. We have the people, our marginalized folks, our racialized folks, our indigenous folks are really ready, and they're waiting for you to finally say, we're going to take a seat back and we're going to let you talk and tell us what we need to do to rectify the issue. So that's why it needs to be done.
And that goes a long way in terms of building trust within the community. Reaching out to the various leaders within a lot of these racialized communities as well. That's a place to start. Whether that is within the indigenous community in terms of leadership, that could be the migrant workers, right? So, right there are ways that this can be accomplished. There's and I struggled with this, and this is a term that you introduced me to, right? Help us understand nothing about us without us. Help the audience understand that a little bit in terms of what we mean by that statement.
Nothing about us without us. It's a vision for anti-racism. It just basically means that any conversations or any decisions that involve the lives and the livelihoods of Black, Indigenous, and people of color must include Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That is just in a nutshell what it means. And so like Laurabel was saying, like we are a part of these communities. And so part of having that conversation is to start from a point when we are recognizing that our communities are not raceless places, are not, are not the myth of homogeneous places that we've been taught. So once we recognize that we are seeing that racialized folks are part of our communities, and therefore they need to take part in the conversations about how we build communities. And I think So last night, and I just want to talk a little bit about the migrant experience and how that just sort of like connects to this vision of nothing about us without us. Last night we were hearing the panel for healthy democracy, and I was hearing a lot about representation and how to involve people in the political process. And this is a very interesting conversation to have for migrants, because migrants are politically disenfranchised entirely. Migrants cannot vote, they cannot run for municipal governments. So how do you ensure that people who are not taking part of the political processes are being taken into consideration when we are building communities? And that is a really important conversation to have. And I think in order to have that conversation, we need to start from that place of acknowledgement that people are already being disenfranchised from the process. And from there, we can build on. And we can build on this idea of how we are welcoming newcomers and how we're welcoming migrants. And also, by the way, for people who don't know what I mean by migrants, I just mean anybody who, who moved from their country of birth or their country of residence to make Newfoundland, Labrador their home. That's what I mean by migrants. And so basically, migrants, because they're being disenfranchised, they often do not have access to healthcare. They do not have access to a number of public services. They do not have access to meaningful immigration services. And that is already affecting their experiences within our communities. And it's important to realize that. So when we are welcoming migrants into our communities, we need to ensure that migrants are defining what welcoming means and what already within that larger disenfranchisement of the system, how can they be accommodated, how their needs can be met within that space, and how we can ensure that we are truly, not just talking the talk of like migrants building the economy, but also actually ensuring that people's accessibility needs, for example, are being met whenever we're talking about community programs, for example. And I think that it is really important. And I think one important conversation to have is that there are organizations that are already doing that work. Like the Anti-Racism Coalition, for example, is doing a campaign on healthcare for all for migrants. And they're already exploring ways in which, like, how are these barriers affecting these communities? So having these organizations inform the ways in which we can contribute and we can create inclusive conversations it's crucial.
And then beyond that, it's okay. So as a migrant worker, you're here, or as a CFA or newcomer or what have you, you're here. You go to MUN, you obtain your degree and so on. What about that retention piece, right? So it's one thing to talk about, hey, we'd love to have we have a great immigration policy, and we're attracting new talent to the province and all of these things. Even if it's attracting talent from other areas within Newfoundland and Labrador, from the Indigenous community, by example, are there structures on support systems set up here across the province that speak to the needs of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? That's also something that you need to look at as well. So it's great that all of these things are being talked about, but there are so many pieces that need to be in place in order to support growth, development, welcoming, this displacement, this feeling of displacement, and so forth. Some of those things need to be done as well. So I think I'll give Robert some of the harder work in terms from an Indigenous perspective, municipal work, service delivery. Like there's so many things there, in terms of what this looks like from an anti-racism framework for Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'd like for you to expand on some of those aspects. Municipal work, service delivery, economy, cultural life. We're not taking anything away from anyone. It's being added to, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. Just building on that conversation about nothing about us without us. Whenever you're thinking about how you might want to, deliver your any of the services that you're offering, or even just as you're trying to promote what your municipality is doing, you want to make sure that that is done in ways that are representative of all of the people who either are living there now or might want to live there in the future, so that these are again like safe and welcoming communities. So. Like putting that into practice in an Indigenous lens is recognizing that we as Indigenous peoples have always been here. We've always been responsible stewards of the land, and we've always made every effort to make everyone here feel welcome in that as well. So when we're putting like nothing about us into practice and thinking about it through each of our service deliveries, is asking yourself who is around the room when we're making these decisions, who's around the table, who is or is not represented in these questions of what should our new swimming center look like, what bus routes might we need to offer, or what routes do we need to clear in our snow, like any like. It may not sound obvious at first, but when you start having conversations with racialized and Indigenous people about the layered impacts of services that are offered or not offered, or programs that are offered or not offered, or even just the way that we talk about our municipalities and who we see represented, if as an Indigenous person, I've never seen an Indigenous person on my municipal council, or seen anyone hired by that municipal council to do work in there, I'm going to have often a harder time engaging or trusting that they have that anti-racism framework. So it's about that at all levels of decision making throughout whatever it is that we're doing and whatever institution we're in, that all voices and views are included. And that also just makes things easier so that things don't have to wait until we get to a blow up before we start talking about how to put anti-racism into practice. Just by having more voices and views in the room at any time we're making decisions helps just makes the process easier and smoother for everyone.
So, top down, bottom up, middle out.
All of the above.
All of the above, right? And that's essentially the way that it needs to go. So there's a number of lived experiences here in the province, across Canada, throughout the United States, and things like that. But different lived experiences, different privileges, leads to different care.
So different lived experiences, different levels of privilege, live to different care. So with that, we can look at, if we look at healthcare being the main example, something as simple as having an MCP card, something that is a struggle for most people who are not native to Newfoundland. So if you're born here, your MCP card is done the same line as your birth certificate, all that is handled really easy. If you're an immigrant, you might have language barriers as to filling out the forms to get your MCP card. You have transportation as to going to get your MCP card. It's not as easy as a service. So when we talk about different life experiences and different levels of care, what might be important to someone who's brand new to the province, someone who's just getting their feet wet, is not the same thing to someone who has lived here for multiple years and has faced these struggles time after time after time. So when we're talking about having multiple voices at the table, each person is speaking from their personal experience. You can't speak for others, and you need to give those who have experiences the chance to speak for themselves, and those who have the authority and the power to make decisive decisions and changes in the system have to let those voices be heard.
Exactly. Even something simple as you mentioned healthcare, even some of the wayfinders, right? Maybe by moving away from written cues to graphical cues, right? In terms of that, because that's a language barrier in some senses. In terms of participation, the barrier there, in terms of trust, it's the same thing. It's a language barrier. So how am I able to get involved in the process if I'm unable to decipher, read the written words, vote, right? So there are a number of things that on that spectrum that need to happen. So we're going to kind of move toward the tail end of our discussion. It's been a great one, that's for sure. Overall, like what is ARC's role in some of these things? So, we've been involved in various levels, from informing, and that's just the brain trust and intellectual capital discussions such as this, lived experiences, what can be done, cannot be done, what should be done, thought process, things of that nature. Lived experience is probably one of the more powerful ways of having folks understand, and yes, we're going to get, and we've already received this, you're too sensitive. It's not about sensitivity, right, at all. It's respect and equity, equality, and so forth. And some people think that those are buzzwords, but they're really not. So informing, and that's working with not just MNL but other organizations on that aspect. And then we've done some consultation work, some paperwork as well, white papers and so forth that have been published, and those are one-on-one engagements. So those are some of the ways that you can engage ARC-NL. And then there's that collaborative piece, which is the part that we all really enjoy, is that collaborative piece. And that, Maria, by example, is one of the things that you're doing. Collaboration, it's taking these various voices, these various pieces, putting them together, making them meaningful, and actually gathering the data for those voices from the folks that are directly impacted and involved. So you truly have their voice. And making a long-term program out of those things. So whether that's legislative changes, maybe someone here run for council or something, But we if we want a voice, we've talked about this throughout, the session. We need a voice at the table. We need to be heard, understood. We need to just be listened to. You can, listen to someone and not really hear them, right? That needs to be there. Top down, bottom up, middle out, and you hear this more and more. You're hearing, that methodology all the time. These issues started with leadership, and I tweet this and put it on my Facebook all the time. It starts up here. It's got to end up here as well, because groundswell alone, is not gonna do it. So I would like to take the last, maybe 10 minutes or so, and see if there's any questions from. Let's do that. Question?
Thanks, Vincent. Yeah, it's Craig here. We've got a whole bunch of comments in the chat and a couple questions. A lot of people saying it's been an amazing conversation, an enlightening conversation. A bunch of people saying they want to learn more about the racism that people face, how it shows up in your day-to-day activities and our day-to-day activities. The microaggressions, that sort of thing. They're really interested in learning more about it. And I know at MNL, we've got a plan. We're working on a plan to do a lot more work with ARC-NL, with First Light, with First Voice, with a group of organizations to help get that stuff to our members. But I'm sure ARC-NL has material that can be shared as well. So we'll have some of that stuff available on our website. So a lot of comments about that. A lot of comments, or several comments about people facing racism themselves in their community and identifying with the things that you're talking about. A question from Megan Hollett, who wonders, do any of you have times when that you can describe when you felt truly welcomed in Newfoundland and Labrador? And what did that look like to you?
Oh, I'll jump on that one in a heartbeat. I'm co-owner of a company called Furniture Medic. So we do upholstery and woodwork and all this kind of stuff. We do a lot of house calls, and I love going out, around the bay. I love going out on calls like that. The moment I ring that doorbell and the person comes to the door, is a smile on their face because they know I'm there to fix something. But they will not allow me to leave without eating something, right? There's soup going, there, pea soup, and the conversations are phenomenal. Unfortunately, I kind of find it the opposite in town. It could be 90 degrees in the house, and I am drenched and not even offered a glass of water, right? Huge differences. So, being and feeling welcomed. Our business has been here for 6 years. It's been phenomenal, the support that we've had from the community in terms of the work that we do. People are willing to wait 6 months, 8 months, a year to get in, for us to do their work. Proud of those things. That's been that's been my experience so far. It's just it's just sometimes the bad outweighs all the good that happens sometimes, right? It erodes it or erases it.
So personally feeling welcome was my first experience moving off campus. So when you live on the university campus, you're in your own little bubble. What happens at MUN doesn't always transfer over when you leave MUN. So when you go about looking for apartments and my roommates were, the first time I moved off campus, my roommates were Newfoundlanders, true and true, born and bred, this is the only place they've ever called home. But being able to go there and still feel like it was my home, where their family welcomed me and I became part of their family and their friends. And it became as much as when I had to move out to get my own apartment for the first time, they're like, do you need help? What do you need to set yourself up outside of this place where you've called home for the last 3 months? That's where I truly felt like, okay, if this is where I'm staying, I'm comfortable with this.
Honestly, I think the first time that I felt a sense of true welcome and I was like, okay, I'm okay, was when it was my first year of university, and it was really hard to meet friends and it was hard to make connections with Canadian friends. There was very few international students at the time, 8 years ago in Grenfell. And there was no other Colombians. There was very, very few other Latin Americans in the group. And this group of Belizean people. I lived in Belize a couple of years before moving here, and one of the coordinators of the university, who was Belizean, just invited the Belizean community plus Maria to go to this potluck that was just Newfoundland food, and I just felt okay, there is community to be had, and there is people who will welcome you. And I just felt so grateful that somebody would just make a space when I just felt that there was no community there, and that was a true moment for me.
Yeah, I want to pause for 1 second to hopefully feel welcome the folks that mentioned in the chat about experiences of racism that you felt, and I want to make you feel welcome in reaching out to the Anti-Racism Coalition about ways that we might be able to talk through those experiences or do work to better support you through those experiences and help apply, or whether it's informing, consulting, or collaborating on projects to better that experience in the future, not only for you but whoever else might come after you. But in terms of my relation to the experiences of feeling welcome in this place, is that I actually kind of feel in reverse, in that my youngest years are the years that I felt the most welcome in this place, because those are the years that I didn't even know I was Indigenous. When I was still, hunting, fishing, out in the woods, lived in the woods as a kid, and have always been very active in community and was always welcome and embraced in that way. But as I sort of in my later years have now struggled with understanding my Indigenous identity and that part of my relation to this place, it's the more that I visibly presented myself as Indigenous in certain contexts, those are the moments when I've been made to feel unwelcome. So the moments that I now find most welcoming are the times when I'm most able to connect with Indigenous culture and practices. So going to the Halipu Mi'kmaq youth gathering that happened this past fall was one of the most, in recent years, times that I felt the most welcome, because it's, again, getting back to the land and its peoples.
So one more question. I think we have time for one more, maybe.
Sure.
Wondering what thoughts the panel can offer on what might be the low-hanging fruit that schools can do to help children, parents, teachers, and administrators navigate this space and navigate this conversation. And I think that might actually apply to more than just schools.
Ooh, that is, well, just so happens that I am the co-chair of the ARC Education and Training Committee. So there honestly there is no easy answer. I mean, you've got to go from K to 12 for something like that. And it's not just the students, right? It's also the teachers. It's the administration. It's signage. It's text and sessions like this, bringing in speakers and so forth. It's not. I don't think I could. With only a few minutes left, I don't think I could do it justice. But it's also working with the Ministry of Education. It's working with MNL. It's working with the city councils. The mayor needs to get involved. The Minister of the Prime Minister, the Premier. I mean, that's really one of those things that it's top down, bottom up. Is it needed? Is it wanted? Will there be pushback? Things like that. And we've seen some of those instances in other jurisdictions. So that's a harder discussion to have, I would say. Yeah, but it's possible for sure.
I think, can I jump in for a sec? Yeah. Just because it's an interesting point, because MNL represents an entire sector of local governments, 275 independent governments. And one of the things that we need to come to grips with as an organization, and Kathleen and I and the staff have had this conversation, we don't know what the answer is. You folks don't know what the entire answer is. The only way we're going to get an answer is by a conversation around creating. So we're going to make suggestions, you're going to poke holes, you're going to make suggestions, we're going to poke holes, and eventually, after trial and error, we're going to find some things that work.
Yes.
And every time something works, you stick that, and then you go try to solve the next problem. And the same process will happen. But it's going to be important that we co-create whatever it is that we're going to do. So we're looking forward to that journey of working with you.
Yep. And it's not something that we have to start from square one. I mean, there are great examples out there in other jurisdictions in Canada that we're able to leverage and then build from and make our own, right? Because Newfoundland, really and truly, it is a unique place, right? It is a unique place and a lot of people in Canada, across Canada, don't realize or understand that. So.
And one place to start from in terms of like low-hanging fruit from the experience of Indigenous peoples is, if you haven't read it in a while, it's been out for a few years, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission still has a bunch of great points that you can use to better your program delivery. And a lot of them, we often think, oh yeah, these are provincial and federal jurisdiction, but a number of them do specifically name things that municipalities can do as well. So looking back through those recommendations, and in terms of an education delivery, like if you're doing a land acknowledgement, making sure that people are thinking through, well, what are each person's relations with that land acknowledgement, more than it just being a box that you check. What is your individual actual history, relation to the place? What are you doing beyond just the acknowledgement? How are you meaningfully educating in schools? What anti-racism best practices are you learning from? Are you actually bringing in anti-racist voices to do that work? Because if you're not coming from a place of lived experiences and trying to do that education, it's much harder to deliver it with like the nuance and the fullness that it needs in order to do it effectively. So that's a couple pieces of low-hanging fruit.
Well, I think we're kind of out of time, but I do have some closing thoughts. Anti-racism, it's a journey that we as a minority community are embarking on, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But we don't believe that that's anything dissimilar than the history of Newfoundland and Labrador in terms of, that century of fear that Newfoundland experienced with the rest of across the rest of Canada, in terms of who are these people, who are these these folks, enduring that classist rhetoric that's always been there and is still there, in certain areas across Canada toward Newfoundland and Labrador. The varying elite power structures that have consistently, forced decisions on Newfoundland and Labradorians. So this should be considered another great turning point in defining Newfoundland and Labrador. So anti-racism work, it's not quick, it's not simple, nor is it an easy process, but it is of great importance to us. As we learn to appreciate each other's great similarities and very, very small differences like color, age, orientation, origin, things like that. So, thank everyone that participated. Stay blessed, be a blessing, and above all, remain safe. Laurabel, thank you so much for being here and participating. Robert, continue to learn a lot from you. Maria, continues to learn a lot from everyone here. And it's actually nice to see all you folks in person. And considering all of our Zoom calls, I am actually the only person that rarely ever turns on the video because I have strange facial expressions and I'm afraid to roll my eyes or do something, like that and offend anyone. So I'm rarely on video. MNL, Kathleen, Craig, I mean, Amy, Deidre, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to speak to your members. And we hope we're here for any questions, follow-ups, things of that nature. If we need to do more of these, well, we'll create podcasts and specifically for M&L and based on the subject matter or topics of interest, and we'll put them out there for you. All right, so, well, something like that.